concerns have also been heard, as we now have plans submitted to us, which we will hear more about later today, for a new visitor's entrance to the White House. Since 1994, in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, the White House has steadily become, because of very real security concerns, more and more walled off from the general public by an expanding complex of unsightly security barriers and fencing. With the White House's visitor center submission, we are seeing the most significant, concerted, real efforts to restore public view sheds and improve the pedestrian experience around the White House in 3 decades. And I like to think that the NCPC has been part of the impetus for action on that front. After the formal presentations in March, commissioners had the opportunity to ask questions and comment, and we then heard public testimony for many hours. I want to emphasize that everyone who wanted to be heard on this project was heard. We did not require in-person testimony as we could have. We heard from folks all over the country, and even a presentation from a couple of well-meaning, if rather misguided, engineers from Venezuela who proposed a massive geodesic freedom dome on the South Lawn, which for the record I do not support. I commend so many members of this commission for sitting through the many hours of testimony and thoughtfully considering the testimony that we heard. I want to note that we would have been within our rights as a commission to immediately vote on the ballroom at that point. Indeed, we had a seconded motion on the floor at that time. Instead, we held that motion over to give us more time to properly consider the matter before us in light of the testimony and the materials that we had before us. I have now personally read every single comment submitted to this commission. That has not been a simple or a quick task, but as chairman, I thought it was my duty. I heard every minute of public testimony on this project. I've reviewed our staff's recommendations, and I've reviewed the project materials submitted to us at great length. I should note that many of the negative comments that were submitted to us during this process were frankly unresponsive. They dealt with issues beyond the scope of this commission, the private funding of the ballroom, for instance, or interior decorations, or the demolition process, or were simply opinions on the president himself. Considering issues of this sort is not within our mandate. We are not some sort of free-ranging ballroom justice commission. A great many of the negative comments we received were also copies or variations on a number of what I found to be unhelpful form letters circulated by groups that oppose the ballroom. While I always commend members of the public for engaging with civic processes, I would have preferred to hear unvarnished views as opposed to picked over uninformed language repeated hundreds or thousands of times. I took much more seriously the number of serious architectural critiques that we received. Some were from noted architects, others from simply interested members of the public who took the time to send us their thoughts and comments. And to those members of the public, I thank you, and I want to assure you that I considered your views before coming to my decision today. Today, I will be voting in favor of this project, and I want to explain why. In doing so, I hope my fellow commissioners will indulge me, I think it would be instructive to discuss the actual architectural history of the White House and the White House complex in order to properly contextualize the project that we have before us. And in doing so, I believe that I will address many of the public and architectural concerns that we've received during this process. In 1792, President George Washington and then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson launched a design competition to design what was then called the President's House. The submission that won out was that of James Hoban. It was inspired, many say, by Leinster House in Dublin, one of the greatest examples of 18th century Georgian architecture in Ireland, with Palladian elements particularly prominent. Design and construction did not end with Hoban, though, by a very long shot. And indeed, if you look at the White House today, it bears very little resemblance to the original Hoban design. Jefferson, who had criticized the White House previously as big enough for, quote, 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama in the bargain, on taking office actually quickly saw a need for expansion. He added colonnades to house various service spaces that would otherwise have been in outbuildings, significantly expanding the original footprint of the White House. Shortly thereafter, of course, the building was substantially burned to the ground by the British during the War of 1812, for which I've still not forgiven them, requiring total reconstruction. And the building that was rebuilt thereafter quickly departed from the relatively simple original Hoban design. James Monroe added the south portico. Andrew Jackson, very controversially, as I alluded to before, added the north portico in 1830. These 2 imposing classical design elements were roundly criticized for their cost and extravagance in their day, but are now perhaps the defining architectural features of the White House. Sprouting up next to the White House, of course, a short while later was the imposing edifice of the Treasury Building. Growing from a relatively small classical structure begun in 1836 to the massive four wings that it encompasses today by 1869, the Treasury grew to dwarf in footprint and massing the White House that it sat beside. During the same time period, the continued viability of the White House as the presidential residence and seat of government was repeatedly called into question for many reasons, but including the fact that it just simply wasn't big enough. Both before and after the Civil War, there were numerous proposals to move or to substantially rebuild the White House, but none of these were pursued. What occurred instead was simply sprawl. The complex started growing in a largely disorganized and ad hoc fashion. On the west side of the White House, for instance, connected to the West Colonnade, massive greenhouses and conservatories grew and grew and grew, until indeed several decades later, by the turn of the 20th century, their footprint rivaled the executive mansion, dwarfing any comparable structures on the east side of the building short of the Treasury, and were considered a vital and historic part of the White House complex. Indeed, as a side point, those who speak today about the historical symmetry of the White House as it relates to the ballroom proposal are essentially speaking about a fictional history of the building, not present since the very earliest days of our republic. The White House complex as a whole has never been symmetrical, since perhaps the 1830s, if even then. And then whether it was the burgeoning Treasury Department to one side or the greenhouse facilities on the other, the White House complex in its first century grew in fits and spurts, and it has continued to do so until the present day. Beginning in 1871, rising just to the west of the conservatories and greenhouses, was a new massive addition to the complex. The State War and Navy Building, now called the EEOB, dwarfs the White House, overtopping and literally overshadowing it. With little in the way of architectural coherence with the White House and Treasury, its Second Empire styling and design was roundly criticized. Mark Twain called it the ugliest building in America. Henry Adams called it an architectural insane asylum. Franklin Delano Roosevelt considered a near total redesign of its facade, as it was still reviled as an architectural atrocity in his time. Today, of course, views differ significantly, and most consider it to be quite beautiful, if somewhat discordant with the White House. By 1892, the White House complex was such a mess, and so clearly underbuilt given the demands of the presidency at that time, that Benjamin Harrison and his formidable wife Caroline proposed a total redesign of the complex, adding diagonal connectors on the east and west of the executive mansion, connecting to two massive halls on either side, equal in size to the executive mansion, that could contain office space, entertaining space, galleries for art and historical artifacts. This plan was never implemented, but it shows that certainly by 1892, the same arguments being made for the ballroom, the same needs being identified, were an issue for the presidency. Proceeding into the 20th century, we get Teddy Roosevelt, who demolished the half-century-old greenhouses and conservatories, drawing intense public ire in doing so, and threw up office space to the west of the West Colonnade, forming what is today the West Wing, or at least the roots of the West Wing. Roosevelt also built a small East Wing to serve as an entrance and cloakroom, which was later largely demolished in the 1940s before being rebuilt. The West Wing grew under Hoover, burned down, was rebuilt, and then FDR effectively tripled its size, adding 2 floors and what is now the Oval and Cabinet Suite to the south of the West Wing. FDR also added a swimming pool under the West Colonnade. Truman tore the entire White House interior down to its studs, substantially rebuilding it, and for good measure added the Truman balcony to the south facade, for which he was, of course, roundly condemned. Kennedy added the Situation Room complex, a large addition to the south of the West Wing. Nixon put a press room in where the swimming pool was, again drawing public condemnation. I could go on and on and on. My core point is that the White House is ever-changing, ever-evolving, to meet the programmatic needs of an ever-changing and evolving United States presidency. And any argument that relies on the idea that the White House is unchangeable, or should be unchangeable, flies in the face of the very history of the structure such critics claim they are trying to protect. And so we arrive at the latest project to be proposed as an addition to the White House, the ballroom to be built on the site of the old East Wing. Since at least the Harrison administration, and you could make the argument since the days of Andrew Jackson, there has been a recognized need for a large entertaining and event space on the White House complex. Modern presidents have accommodated this programmatic need for large events by erecting unsightly tents on the oft swampy land of the South Lawn. Nobody can argue that this is a good idea or that it befits the presidency of the greatest and most powerful country that has ever existed in history. We've been told by the White House project team and by architect Shalom Baranas that they are looking to build a ballroom that can seat 1,000, while also accommodating the needs of the presidency: security, ingress, egress, room for various ceremonies, etc. We typically defer to applicants when they define their programmatic needs. That's as true for this project as it is for a parking garage or a cellular tower or any number of other projects that regularly come before this commission. But I will note that the Washington Hilton seats over twice as many in its ballroom. 1,000 is not an unreasonable number programmatically, and not an unreasonable amount of space, especially given that presumably many events to be held there might have fewer people, but require space for entertainment, a dais for speeches, room for displays, and require substantial space for visiting dignitaries. The proposed ceiling is high, but I would think that a ballroom for the president, and indeed for the United States, for the most important civic events in our country, befits a high ceiling. Some of the architectural critiques we received have focused on the kitchen, which is currently to be at ground level. Some have suggested that if the kitchen were moved underground, the entire height of the structure could be reduced significantly. We've also been told, however, by the project team that subterranean construction is simply not possible, owing to other programmatic needs below grade. And I want to speak very carefully here. The president has spoken publicly to an extent about what is being built below the ballroom. And for obvious reasons, I will not go further than he has on the subject. But I will note that there are sealed entries on the docket of the court case brought against the ballroom project by the National Trust. And I think it is therefore safe for the public and for this commission to assume that these subterranean programmatic needs are serious and unmovable, and as noted in public docket entries, related to national security. It is, of course, also public record that FDR built an emergency bunker beneath the old East Wing, for which he was actually criticized at the time. Other critiques that we have received have emphasized personal animus towards President Trump, that he is simply building a ballroom for his own use. I will note, though, that even if the current construction timeline holds, as I expect it will, President Trump will get very limited use of this structure before the end of his term, and that the real beneficiaries will be future presidents of all political stripes and dispositions and their administrations, as well as, of course, the American people. The ballroom, as proposed, while large, fits neatly into the White House complex, nestled as it is between the Executive Mansion and the much larger Treasury building. It does not overtop and overshadow the Executive Mansion, as does the Eisenhower building, and its neoclassical architecture matches and complements the neoclassical elements of the Executive Mansion, in contrast again to the Eisenhower building with its Second Empire features. I've spoken at length about the history of the White House today. I've done so because perhaps the only constant in the history of the White House is that practically every change, every modification, every addition, and indeed every feature that we now celebrate as an iconic aspect of the White House was roundly and viciously condemned in its day. The critiques of the ballroom today are therefore oddly familiar to those of us who have studied the White House and its surroundings. Just as the north and south porticos, the West Wing, the Truman balcony, and every other aspect of the White House are now celebrated, I believe too, in time, the ballroom will be celebrated as a crucial and contributing aspect of the White House complex. And as I said previously, I intend to support it today. Commissioner Blair.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, how can I follow that? Now have a good history of the White House. I would just say, obviously, I think the team has worked very hard to make this a good and beautiful structure. I agree that the president will get very limited use. I think it's worth noting that the architect of this structure, who I think is here with us today, is a renowned architect that has contributed a lot to the city and region and has won countless awards for his work. I think his firm has received 250 or so awards over its 4 decades based on my research. And he can correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably more, including some of the most prestigious awards in architecture. He was one of the youngest fellows of the American Institute of Architects ever admitted, which is a standout of his record. And I won't go through all of the buildings in the area that they have participated in, but all of the top level awards you can win in architecture, pretty much he's won and his firm has won. And I think to treat this project as different or somehow not from the same lineage of art and artistic design, simply because there are some people who I think for clearly political reasons don't like the project, is a shame. And I think it is an unfair besmirching of the architect. Further, the president, who obviously has had a hand in this design, is a builder himself. And he too has won numerous architecture designs and architecture awards for buildings he has built over the years, as well as hospitality awards and many others. So I think that's worth noting because the purpose of the ballroom really blends the two things. It blends great architecture with great hospitality, which is something the president cares deeply about because it represents the American people. That's what the White House does. It's not his house. He is the current occupant, but it is the American people's house, and he feels that way. And as I've said in my comments previously, the goal of this is to be able to give the American people or visitors. The King of England will be here at the end of the month, and we will likely dine in tents. When the president was recently in the United Kingdom, they dined in Windsor Castle. It's a little bit different. And, we would say that it is not fitting of the presidency or the White House to have to invite the king of our oldest ally and perhaps most loyal ally to come and eat in tents on the White House lawn. They deserve a better experience. I think that the public comment was well heard, despite the obvious campaigns that were, I would say, unserious in their critiques of the architecture of the project itself.